Ebola is a virus in the family Filoviridae and the genus Ebola virus. 5 virus species have been identified, 4 of which are known to cause disease in humans. The 4 species that cause disease in humans are Ebola virus, Sudan virus, Thai forest virus, and Bundibugyo virus. The 5th species is Reston virus, and that virus has not caused disease in humans, but is known to have affected non-human primates. Some of the characteristics of Ebola are that the virus is elongated and filamentous. It varies between 800 and 1,000 micrometers, but can reach up to 14,000 micrometers. The diameter is uniform and is usually about 80 micrometers. It contains a helical nucleocapsid, which contains a central axis, and is enveloped by a helical capsid and has cross striations. Ebola is also characterized as a pleomorphic viral fragment, which means that it can change shapes. And some of these shapes could be the shape of a 6 or a U or even a circle. Also, Ebola is contained within a lipid membrane, and each virion contains a single strand of non-segmented negative sense viral genomic RNA, which is also part of its genome. As you can see by the genome, the gene order is a 3-letter NP, VP35, VP40, GP/SGP, VP30, VP24, L, trailer 5. The leader and the trailer are non-transcribed regions, which carry important signals to control transcription, replication, and packaging of the viral genomes into new virions.
In terms of being acquired, the Ebola virus is spread through direct contact with blood or other bodily fluids, such as feces or vomit, of infected persons, including close contact with deceased Ebola victims, which are highly infectious. Humans typically are infected with Ebola either through contact with bodily fluids of infected animals or humans, caring for patients, or preparing for the deceased for burial. Some of the environmental factors associated with Ebola are bat species, geographics, and the changings of landscapes. Ebola is transmitted through direct contact with bodily fluids. Ebola can only be transmitted when symptoms are present. The incubation period of a disease is the time between the initial infection and when the symptoms appear. Ebola's incubation period is anywhere from 2 to 21 days and is fairly short compared to many other infectious diseases such as HIV, which can have an incubation period of 10 years or longer. Ebola is one of the most deadly infectious diseases, causing death in approximately 50 to 90% of those who become infected. Some of the signs and symptoms for Ebola include fever, severe headache, muscle pain, weakness, fatigue, diarrhea, vomiting, abdominal pain, and unexplained hemorrhage. These symptoms may appear anywhere from the 2 to 21 days after exposure to Ebola, but the average is between 8 and 10 days.
Diagnosing Ebola in a person who has been infected for only a few days is difficult because the early symptoms, such as fever, are nonspecific to Ebola infection and are often seen in patients with more common diseases such as malaria and typhoid fever. However, a person should be isolated and should notify public health authorities if they have had early symptoms of Ebola and have had contact with blood or bodily fluids from a person sick with or who has died from Ebola, objects that have been contaminated with the blood or bodily fluids of a person sick with or who has died from Ebola, infected fruit bats and primates, or semen from a man who has recovered from Ebola. Samples from the patient can then be collected and tested to confirm infection. Ebola virus is detected in blood only after onset of symptoms, most notably fever, which accompany the rise in circulating virus within the patient's body. It may take up to 3 days after symptoms start for the virus to reach detectable levels. The text box shows the timeline of Ebola and what tests are available during each time period.
Currently, there is no vaccine to prevent Ebola, no treatments for the disease, other than treatments for its symptoms and some experimental treatments, and no cure. Other diseases have treatments but no vaccine and no cure, such as HIV, while there are still others that have vaccines but cannot be treated or cured, such as the measles. The table on the right compares the Ebola virus with well-known infectious diseases. Ebola is one of the most deadly infectious diseases, causing death in approximately 50 to 90% of those who become infected. This is a much higher percentage than almost all of the other infectious diseases included in the chart. Case fatality rates for the other diseases are much lower, such as the influenza, which is less than 1%, and SARS, which is 13 to 43%. There is a study called the Sierra Leone trial to introduce a vaccine against Ebola called STRIVE. It is designed to assess the safety and efficacy of a candidate Ebola vaccine among health and other frontline workers. This trial is put together by the University of Sierra Leone and the CDC working together. Some facts you may not know about Ebola are: the Ebola virus that's causing the recent outbreaks is not constantly changing, and there is no expectation that it will change significantly. Ebola was first discovered in 1976 and has pretty much stayed the same ever since. Some other kinds of microbes can change drastically from year to year, including certain flu viruses and the SARS-related viruses. It's extremely unlikely that anyone would catch Ebola from something as simple as being on the same plane or in the same public space with someone who was infected. That's because Ebola isn't airborne. In order to be infected with Ebola, you have to touch the bodily fluids of an Ebola patient, dead or alive. Since Ebola can stay alive on a surface for at least several days, you could also get it from touching bedding or another inanimate object contaminated with those bodily fluids. People generally aren't contagious until they are sick. This means that there's usually a clue that someone might be contagious, such as fever, aches, or diarrhea. These early clues can be confusing since they are often looked like other things, such as the flu or diarrhea-related illnesses. The current Ebola outbreak has had a survival rate of about 40% per the latest numbers from the World Health Organization, and a good medical care can help people survive. There are 5 types of the Ebola virus, and the one that's causing the current outbreak has had an overall survival rate of about 30% since it was first discovered in 1976. The countries at the center of the outbreak, which are Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone, are among the poorest in the world. All 3 have GDPs per capita that are less than Haiti's. As such, a lot of the job fighting Ebola in Western Africa has fallen to non-governmental organizations such as Doctors Without Borders. The high rate of international travel these days means that if it's possible for a single case of an infectious disease to pop up somewhere far-flung, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there will be a giant outbreak in that new location. A lot depends on how the virus is noticed and how prepared the public health system is to deal with it. For example, while the Middle East was battling hundreds of cases of the deadly MERS virus, 2 people brought it to the United States in May, but they didn't spread it to anyone else, and the outbreak never spread. The U.S. has had a strong infrastructure, and experts say that means that Ebola here would never look like the Ebola in West Africa. The worst case scenario is that a person would bring Ebola over to America, get sick, and be in contact with people before anyone realizes that it might be Ebola and bring her to a hospital. But here, our modern hospitals would likely use proper procedures and prevent transmission, and epidemiologists would be able to track down anyone who is at risk of infection and make sure they don't spread it to others. Overall, it's unlikely that Ebola would get any farther than a localized problem in one area.